Good morning. I don't know why every morning when I get ready to begin with you a psalm, I feel the excitement of discovery and the joy of being able to share it with you. And Psalm 36, which is only 13 verses, has lots of surprises in it. And in a moment, I will show the psalm, but I want to share before I begin to read it in its entirety to you some of its famous lines. So I was just checking with Professor Marvin Rosenberg, who has his PhD in molecular biology from Columbia, because Columbia University's motto, which is in Latin, is from our psalm. First, its origin in Hebrew, the words are Bo'orcha nir or. In your light do we see light. And in Columbia's case, they translated it into Latin in lumen tuo vidibus lumen. So I smile knowing of Marvin's Columbia connection. I have my own familial Columbia connections with my wife and my son. Bottom line, I'm reminded when I see something like a university motto in the Psalms, how the Psalms ripple in so many ways into our larger culture. Here's another couple of lines that I had in my notes from a long, long time ago and delighted in rediscovering, namely Abraham Joshua Heschel in his book on theology called God in Search notes that the last words of the Baal Shem Tov were two verses from this morning's Psalm 36. So let me read those two lines. And again, later I'll post it in a moment with the whole flow. First, just in the Tzidkatcha kahare el mishpatecha tehom rabah Adamu v'hema toshia Adonai Maya kar chastecha Elohim uvnei Adam betzel kenafecha yeche sayun. Your righteousness is like the highest mountain, your judgments like the greatest deep. Human and beast you deliver, Adonai. How precious is your kindness, God. People in the shadow of your wings take refuge. So again, for the Baal Shem Tov, of all the verses of Psalms, of all the verses of Scripture, it was two verses from Psalm 36 that he's identified having said as his closing words. And one more, kind of a play, but it's very cute. It's the second to last line. Let not overtake me the foot of arrogance. And in the Art Scroll commentary, they say, many commentators say, but they don't give any citations. But here's what's pointed out. If you take the first letter of each of these four Hebrew words, al tivoeni regel ga'ava, you get the word etrog, the citron that's used on Sukkot, the citron that has to be without imperfections. And so they say, what does it mean for a person to be like an etrog, which is identified with the heart, one without the flaw of arrogance? So that's just a play. Again, only a 13-word psalm. Let me put it up and share my translation. And I will point out as I begin that much of this psalm is pretty straightforward, except not the punchline for me. And that's verses 2 and 3. And I'm going to take some time afterwards to share such diversity of translations of verse 2 and 3. And the diversity is a product of pronouns, not knowing if the he is referring to a person or to God, and punctuation. So those pronouns and punctuation can make enormous differences in translation. But as I read this psalm, I read it on Reflections on Rationalizations, which is how I understand verse 3, 2 and 3. But you'll see there will be other ways of understanding this psalm. And I will also circle back to share with you why I find there to be profoundness in reading it this way. All right, first, let me read the psalm. For the conductor, for the servant of Adonai, for David. Speaking of crimes of the wicked within my heart, there is no fear of God before their eyes, for they smooth it over in their eyes, lest they find their mischievousness to hate. The words of their mouth are iniquity and mischief. They have ceased to apply wisdom to do good. Mischief they devise upon their bed. They establish themselves on a path that is not good. Evil they do not disdain. Adonai, in the heavens is your kindness. Your faithfulness extends to the skies. Your righteousness is like the highest mountains. Your judgments like the greatest deep. Human and beast you deliver, Adonai. How precious is your kindness, God. People in the shadow of your wings take refuge. They overflow with the rich oils of your house, and from the stream of your delights you give them drink. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. Continue your kindness to those that know you, and your righteousness to the upright in heart. Let not overtake me the foot of arrogance, and let the hand of the wicked not cause me to wander away. Over there have fallen the workers of a mischief. They are thrust down and unable to get up. Now, classic commentators have reflexively looked for stories in King David's life that this psalm emerges from. And the fact that there are so many different alternatives only indicates that there is no necessary historic trigger. Verse 13, for instance, is identified with Achitophel, that general of David who turned on him to side with his son in rebellion, who would ultimately die by being caught in a tree. So that's where he's thrust down, unable to get up. But we'll take it from the top. And here's some things that are distinctive. First, there's 3 fours in the inscription. For the conductor, for the servant of Adonai, for David. Which is, circle the word, the letter lamed, that occurs 3 times, right? Limenatseach, le'eved, Adonai, leDavid. Now, some classic commentators who again want to identify Psalms as written by David would say that, there's a tension, because to call oneself a servant of God is a very high claim. And so normally one wouldn't ascribe that to oneself. It is said of David elsewhere that he is the servant of God, and that echoes Moses being called the servant. But it can be considered a lack of humility to call oneself that. Others would see this in the classic mode as aspiration, that this is a psalm that describes what it means to be a servant of God like David. Now, verse 2 and 3 are again these 2 verses that determine in many ways what's going on in the psalm, and at the same time are subject to great uncertainty. Take the first word of verse 2. The verse ne'um means speak. It's not an uncommon word. It appears 373 times in Tanakh, so it's widely available. But in almost all, it's Ne'um Adonai. So it's God is speaking. There are other cases where people will do ne'um, whether David or even Bil'am in the book of Numbers, but it's in the context of oracle. So Bil'am will use the word ne'um, but he is getting his words that he is speaking from God. Now here's what's remarkable, and here's a fancy word. Hapex legomenon. Hapex legomenon is a word that only appears once. That may be in all of a language, it may be in a particular book. In all of Psalms, this is the only place that the word ne'um appears. And therefore, is ne'um here oracle? So translate ne'um as oracle, God speaking, or take the second word, ne'um pesha. Is pesha, crime, speaking, an oracle? So I want to read you a number of translations of verses 2 and 3, and then I'm going to circle back to why I chose to translate it the way that I did. So I'll start with the Jewish Publication Society, in that it's considered to be, among Jewish scholars, the most common. So he starts, "Bekarevli be," verse 2, is in the midst of my heart. And back to the word order of Hebrew and English, they also can be flipped. So this is how verses 2 and 3 are translated in JPS. "I know what transgression says to the wicked. He has no sense of the dread of God, because its speech is seductive to him, till his iniquity be found out, and he be hated." So here it's transgression, pesha, that second word, speaking to seduce the sinner, but ultimately his transgression will be found out and he'll be hated. Okay, you have that one. Now, let me read to you, always by contrast, let me read it to you. Let me read to you Robert Alter's translation. Again, Robert Alter tends to be he's a literature fellow. "Crime's utterance to the wicked within his heart, quote, 'There is no fear of God before my eyes,' unquote, 'for it caressed him with its eyes to find his sin of hatred.'" So here it's crime speaking to him and giving him the sense of hatred. What I kept looking for is the translation. I always look also, but I'm not finding it immediately, which was how it's done in the King James Version. All right, I'm just going to do a couple more, only to show again diversity. Here's an Orthodox translation. That's the Mitsuda of verses 2 and 3. "A discourse of transgression to the wicked is in the midst of my heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for it smooths the way before his eyes, causing him with a capital H, God, to discover his iniquity, for which he will hate him. So here it's God doing the hating. And here's King James. The transgression of the wicked saith within my heart, that there is no fear of God before his eyes. For he flattereth himself in his own eyes, until his iniquity be found to be hateful. There it's vague in King James as to who is finding his iniquity to be hateful. Is it God? Is it his neighbors? Is it himself? I'm going to do two more, and then I'll again bring that to a focus. Here's Martin Cohen, more playful translation of verses 2 and 3. A speech given only in the interior chambers of my heart about the way sin comes naturally to the wicked. The fear of God is invisible before their eyes. Indeed, they glide smoothly along, pausing only for their eyes to seek out opportunities for their favorite sin, to hate. And last, because it's the one I found that I identified with the most, and that's of Richard Levy. Speaking of crimes of the wicked within my heart, there is no God before their eyes, for they smooth it over in their eyes, lest they find themselves hating their crookedness. Now, in that case, I'll pull this all together. You could see that the word ne'um, for some, is simply speech. For others, it's an oracle, because usually ne'um elsewhere in Tanakh is identified with God's speech. Pesha can either be the one speaking or what's being spoken about. Punctuation. The thing that's fascinating, Ein pachad Elohim leneged einav. There is no fear of God before his eyes. There's a consensus. That is what the Psalter is experiencing that a wicked person operates by. But then it's very different in verse 3. For they smooth it over in their eyes is one way to translate it. Or for he, and lest they find their mischievousness to hate. So the second part of 3 can be why they're smoothing it over in their eyes. Why are they rationalizing the fact that they don't fear God? It's because they don't want to address their own mischievousness in their heart. Or it can be until, instead of they, it's really a he, but it can be a capital he, until God finds the mischievousness in their heart. So you can see in 3, it's not about, they're smoothing it over in their eyes, that there's a consensus, but are they doing that in order not to find their mischievousness or not? Here's another piece of this psalm. For Benjamin Siegel, who I'm so fond of, this is his book, he says the following. You see, if you go back down, there's this verse 11 and 12. Continue your kindness to those that know you, and your righteousness to the upright in heart. Let not overtake me the foot of arrogance, and let the hand of the wicked not cause me to wander away. As a result, for Benjamin Siegel, this psalm he entitles, My Wicked Heart. He sees the Psalter as somebody who, this is kind of an AA situation. This is a person who has experienced following the rationalizations himself of evil doing, who broke away from that, but is aware that he is vulnerable to regress. And he will end with a quality of triumph, back to the AA mindset. Over there have fallen the workers of mischief. They are thrust down and unable to get up, which is to say, with the word sham in verse 13, he's separated himself from those others who are still rationalizing to themselves, engaging in that repetitive bad behavior. But he has now, although he's still vulnerable, verse 12, let not overtake me the foot of arrogance. Overtake me in the sense of, if they catch up to me, they could yet seduce me and lead me to wander away from the path of God, from the path of goodness. And so for Benjamin Siegel, this is a psalm of recovery. Again, he calls it my wicked heart. But for me, in reading it, this is a psalm about the dangers of rationalizations, aware that we all have the capacity to rationalize bad behavior. But it doesn't mean we necessarily have to have sunk, if you will, down to the bottom to identify with this psalm, or even to have written this psalm. I, in life have had the sad experience of working with people who are, if you will, engaged in bad behavior that they rationalize away, that has caused me great pain. Sometimes you only know that when you work or live with somebody, their own ability to be self-deceptive and rationalizing bad behavior. And so for me, this is about reflections on rationalization and not necessarily an individual in recovery. All of us have reason to be mindful of this capacity. So let me reread it again to pull it together with some comments for the flow. And as you can see, I ended the quotation marks after 5. Some people only put the quotation marks after verse 2, just the second half in quotation marks. So again, punctuation and pronouns, anomalous words lead to many possible readings. But for me, to pull together, this is a very powerful psalm that I could see myself returning to, both in terms of responding and with the awareness of the pain caused by those who engage in bad behavior and rationalize it away, or my own need to look in the mirror at my own choices that can be again rationalized. I love again verse 3. Ki hechilik elav be'enav, for they smoothed it over, for in the literal, for he smooths it over with his eyes. So he's smoothing over. There is no, what is this person's, if you will, major shortcoming? The key word, it's in verse 2, Ein pachad Elohim leneged einav. There is no fear of God before his eyes. As the commentators will say, why does he have no fear? Because his eyes are not looking at the greatness of the world, which leads to the belief in a creator. He's dismissing any accountability. He lives in Woody Allen's Crimes and Misdemeanors, the movie. There is no eye that watches. You may recall that's a movie about an ophthalmologist who commits a murder. And the question is there an eye that watches? There is no fear of God before his eyes. This is a person who does not acknowledge a God who looks. And back to eyes, that word eyes appears again in verse 3. He smooths it over in his eyes. He is not acknowledging God. All right, I'm going to later change this to being, the bracket is only over the word there in verse 3. Let me read it through a last time, a comment or two, and then open it up for some of your reactions to a powerful Psalm 36. For the conductor, for the servant of Adonai, for David. Speaking of crimes of the wicked within my heart, there is no fear of God before their eyes, for they smooth it over in their eyes, lest they find their mischievousness to hate. The words of their mouth are iniquity and mischief. They have ceased to apply wisdom to do good. Mischief they devise upon their bed. They establish themselves on a path that is not good. Evil they don't disdain. Adonai in the heavens is your kindness. Your faithfulness extends to the skies. Your righteousness is like the highest mountain. Your judgments like the greatest deep. Human and beast you deliver, Adonai. How precious is your kindness, God. People in the shadow of your wings take refuge. They overflow with the rich oils of your house, and from the stream of your delights you give them drink. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. Continue your kindness to those that know you, and your righteousness to the upright in heart. Let not overtake me the foot of arrogance, and let the hand of the wicked not cause me to wander away. Over there have fallen the workers of mischief. They are thrust down and unable to get up. Let me just point out that as it shifts to God in verse 7, it's describing God manifest in the highest mountain, and here El is used. It can be God's mountain, but El is commonly understood also as power, God's strongest, highest mountain, to whom is the greatest depths, so that God is physically everywhere and is the God of all human and behemoth and beast. So God is the creator of, this is universal God, who at the same time provides refuge and delight. And that's the extolling of God with the recognition in verse 12 of yet there is vulnerability for me, despite my recognition of your greatness, which the evil don't recognize. Protect me from them seducing me. Verse 13, because I know that it leads to them not getting up, that it ultimately is a downfall when you do not live im pachad Elohim leneged einav, with the fear of God before our eyes. All right, a rich psalm. Again, a little bit of dwelling on verses 2 and 3 because they are so hard to really pin down. That's part of the power of the poetry. And maybe the ambiguity of verse 2 and 3 is that it simultaneously suggests that the wicked rationalize away their sins lest they get caught, and simultaneously they try to smooth it over but will get caught, so that the he who hates them can be them, is that relates either to the individual or to God. All right, I'll stop the share so that I can see all 27 participants today. That's a delight. Just a couple comments in terms of this psalm. Remarkably, as I point out, only verses 2 and 3 are ambiguous. The rest of the psalm translations are pretty straightforward. But 2 and 3 matter because that's the context for what is the nature of this reflection in his heart, becarively be. So he's back to Benjamin Siegel. He asks the question, how can this righteous person know what's in the heart of an evil person? Only because he's experienced it, he says. I say you don't have to have experienced it yourself as it being your wrongdoing to know that wrongdoing occurs coupled with rationalization. So some thoughts on this powerful psalm. I don't see any hands today. No hands today. Marvin has the privilege of speaking, since not only because he's the first one to go, but as I mentioned, this wonderful line, 3 words in Hebrew, Bo'orcha nir'eh or, in
Yeah.
your light shall we see light. And since Marvin has his doctorate from Columbia, and that's the Columbia motto, go ahead, Marvin.
Well, I gather that those are verses 10 and 11, the motto.
The motto is just 3 words in verse 10.
Oh, I see. Just 3 words.
In Hebrew, just 3 words. In Latin, it's 5 words.
Yeah. I'm thinking that this should be sent directly to Washington.
So back to light. Let me just, so back to light. This psalm is all about eyes, right? You see the verses 2 and verses 3 have this image of, things are getting smoothed over. There's no fear of God before his eyes or before their eyes. The ability to see is clouded. And then in the next is they smooth it over. He smooths it over in his eyes, right? So he's glossing it over. So the inability to see, the sense of the darkness of the evildoer is contrasted with the righteous who have, back to verse 10 and those 3 words, Bo'orcha nir'eh or, with your light, God, we see light. You illuminate, you enlighten us. And so again, there's this play on darkness and light, and that the ability, Marvin, my friend Martin Cohen, as he translates this psalm, I read his playful translation of 2 and 3, he sees this psalm as about the challenge of having faith, that you depend on God to see clearly. So that's another aspect of this play on light that Marvin identified. A closing comment by anyone? So, a closing comment about my mother. I quote my mother more than anyone I know, I have known. Sadly, my mom is now deceased for about 18 years. But my mother used to say that everybody is 2 people. She said a lot of things, but what she meant by that is that everybody has their strong suit of acting at their best. And she would say everybody also has a vulnerable, a weakness side, that everybody is 2 people. And it's been my experience that that's reality. It's true for myself. Sometimes I'm not at my best. And I have learned, you only know somebody's, if you will, darker side when you are close with them, working with them, or living with them, when you see them with their guard down. And this ability of people, sadly, that I've experienced to rationalize bad behavior is quite remarkable. There are people I know who live with very little guilt, Teflon-like, because they will just rationalize bad behavior and in some sense live with no fear of accountability before a greater presence, because they don't want to go to acknowledge to that place of wrongdoing. And so for me, that's why I chose to translate 2 and 3 and to see this as such a powerful psalm of the ability to recognize a capacity of rationalizing bad behavior. And I say it both in how I've seen it in ways that have hurt me on behalf of others, being that second person that others often don't see, that's been pain-making when you see it. And at the same time, like the psalmist here and the closing line of guard me from being overtaken by the foot of pride, let me, in my own sense of complacency, not falter and be drawn to the temptations of feeling like I am good. I have nothing to feel accountable for. And so for me, Psalm 36 is a powerful reflection in how I choose to understand verses 2 and 3 as a description of the Psalter saying, I'm reflecting in my heart what I have seen as the capacity of those who have no fear of God's presence to rationalize away their bad behavior. And what prompts that rationalization is the unwillingness to look at, back to eyes, their own shortcomings. So Psalms are powerful precisely because they are reflections before God on how life is composed, how we are composed as people with our capacities for good and for bad, our capacities to see the beauty of the world, and likewise to be tempted sometimes to be self-serving. Tomorrow's Psalm, Psalm 37, I've just begun to translate last night, is very long. It's 40 verses. So we won't have probably a lot of time to reflect on it. I spent an hour last night and only got through 10 verses in translation. I'll spend much of the day. I'll send you this morning so you can see what I start with, which is an English translation, because I like how the Hebrew is side by side. But because I don't have a finished product, I'll at least begin to show you my process of how I approach retranslating a psalm. I'll show you the original in the prep that you'll get. If there's anybody who has Kaddish, I invite you to stand to join while others have the opportunity to answer Amen and fulfill a mitzvah. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah. V'alma divra kirutei, v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayecha u'yomechon, u'v'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'bizman kariv, v'imru amen. Yehi shmei rabba mevarach, le'olam u'le'olmaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitba'ar, v'yitramam, v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar, v'yitaleh, v'yitalal, shemei dekudusha b'richu, le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, damiran bi'ana v'amen. Hey, lama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'ramav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. It's a delight, Shirley, to see you joining us from the Valley. I'm glad we have this opportunity to honor your need to say Kaddish. Thank you for joining me. Thanks to each of you for your participation today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 10 o'clock for Psalm 37.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Baruch Tiyah. Have a good day, each of you. Stay safe.